In Essential Task 5.2, we are going to begin a sequence of 2 concept maps that both focus on the topic of motivation. I recommend a horizontal concept map for Essential Task 5.2. It incorporates the 4 columns that you see left to right, 7 total boxes. You might notice that there is a even higher categorization above the 4 columns that I just showed you. That categorization is motivation. However, what we talk about in today's concept map only incorporates the 4 columns that you see here. Concept map 5.3 finishes up the 5 remaining columns that you might see over to the right. So we'll begin today by talking about the 4 columns that you see pictured. I'll allow you to pause the video now to copy down the yellow portion at the top of your concept map. We're going to briefly allude to animal psychology and then proceed into talking about human psychology. The term instinct refers to an unlearned fixed behavioral pattern that you notice in a species. So, for example, birds laying their eggs in a nest. These behavioral patterns are unlearned, meaning if that type of animal was isolated from the rest of its species, it would still have given the opportunity to do so, carry out these behaviors. So it's not like these behaviors were learned through observation. This is the first time that we've seen the term evolutionary perspective in this class. Evolutionary perspective is actually the purple color-coded column. It is the color-coded column where if you look one picture down, you'll notice in giant black font the word survival. When we approach psychology from the evolutionary perspective, that's really the underlying question. How has this behavior enabled this species to survive, not just today, but in the long term, throughout the entirety of that species' existence on Earth? So, for example, when you look at birds safely laying eggs in a nest, from an evolutionary perspective, you could argue that that instinct has ensured that birds have been able to safely lay their eggs. Those eggs would then, in theory, hatch safely, allowing those birds to then live their full life, reach the age of reproduction, and carry out that behavioral pattern again and again. Those instinctual behaviors, such as laying eggs, clearly enables long-term survival. So that's the underlying question behind the evolutionary perspective. How has this behavior, whether it's an animal behavior or in some cases a human behavior, enabled that species to survive, not just today, but in the entirety of its existence on Earth? So that's animal psychology. We'll push that off to the side and proceed now into the second column and talk about what's called drive reduction theory. So again, this applies to humans, though you could probably apply this to animals as well, but we're now focused on human psychology. Drive reduction theory is sort of a 3-step process. Drive reduction theory argues that we have physiological needs, biological needs that are required to survive, like food and water. Those needs create drives. And as a result of those drives, we are motivated, thus this occurring in the motivation portion of the unit. We are then motivated as an organism to satisfy those needs. Ultimately, in order to return to what's called homeostasis, which you might recall from bio freshman year, but we're going to define in just a moment. So, for example, if you're hungry, it's a result of your physiological need to eat, to sort of recoup your energy. As a result of that drive, you end up eating. So you have a need for food, for the energy that it provides. You experience hunger, that's the drive. You do a drive-reducing behavior, eating. Water and thirst work the same way. You need water in order to survive, that's the need, the physiological, biological necessity. It creates a drive, thirst, and then you go get something to drink. The underlying premise of drive reduction theory is to always return to what's called homeostasis. You might recall this term from freshman bio. Homeostasis is that nice balance in terms of internal state, meaning our body is at a reasonable temperature. We're not thirsty. We're not hungry. We're sort of in that balance, that equilibrium point. The second we start to experience hunger and thirst, or we're uncomfortable in terms of body temperature, we're out of whack. We're no longer in homeostasis. And according to drive reduction theory, we then carry out drive-reducing behaviors such as eating, drinking, or perhaps changing the temperature, putting on the air conditioner, etc., so that we can return to a nice internal state, that nice balance, that equilibrium point. Drive reduction theory does a really good job explaining what are called primary drives. These are biological necessities needed for the long-term survival of the human species. And I need to make that point really clear, long-term survival. So yes, hunger and thirst are clear drives. They're classified as primary drives. You obviously need them to survive now, but the human species needs access to both food and water for the long-term survival. Things like sexual needs and drives are also classified as primary drives because for the long-term existence of humans, we certainly need to continue to replicate. So these are what we call primary drive. Drive reduction theory does a great job explaining our behavioral patterns that explain eating and drinking and carrying out behaviors to satisfy those primary drives. What drive reduction theory doesn't do as good of a job of is explaining secondary drives. Secondary drives are things that we've had to learn motivate us. Things like fame and fortune, money. At some point in your life, you needed to learn that money was desirable, that fortune and fame and esteem was desirable. Those are not easily explained through drive reduction theory. Drive reduction theory actually does a really poor job of explaining what are called secondary drives. Nevertheless, we still use drive reduction theory. It's still a very prominent explanation for why we eat and drink and turn down the temperature or put on a sweatshirt or turn on the air conditioner. It does a really fantastic job explaining those biological necessities. Proceeding onward into the third column under theories, we're going to talk about the word arousal. Now, the term arousal is a reference to physiological arousal, things like heart rate increase, sweating, breathing, etc. What's called the Yerkes-Dodson law is a direct connection to arousal and arousal theory broadly. Some people call this the upside-down U law. I am going to ask you to copy one of the visuals below, so do leave some space. The Yerkes-Dodson law tries to explain what needs to occur for humans to perform at an optimal level, meaning perform the best at a sporting event, give the best presentation, perform the best during some type of concert or performance art. When we are highly aroused, so our heart rate is high, we're breathing, it's ideal for you to actually be doing a somewhat simple task by and large, meaning if you're highly aroused and you're doing something easy, relatively simple, you're actually going to perform at your best. So, for example, if I gave you 200 pretty simplistic math problems to do, which I would anticipate everyone who's a senior in high school should be able to do, it's easy to make a careless mistake if you have low arousal. If you're kind of slunched over and you're relaxing and you're like, oh, these are so easy, what's the point of this? You're actually quite prone to make a mistake because that task is so simple. It's actually a little bit more ideal to be like, all right, I'm going to focus on these 200, sit up in your chair and actually focus. Doing so will actually enable you to answer all 200 questions. There's the middle point, though, where if the task is more medium, so it's not those simple math questions, it's a medium task. It's not the most challenging thing in the world, but it's also not the easiest. It's ideal to have what we call medium arousal. So we don't want to be too amped up, but we don't want to be too relaxed either. It's actually ideal to be sort of in that middle ground. The other end of it is when it's an actually difficult task. So we're talking about something like playing in a championship game or delivering a really important speech. If you're performing a difficult task, it's actually more ideal to have a little bit of a lower arousal, not too low to the point where you're a zombie, but low enough arousal that you're cool, calm, and collected. So when you look at this, it sort of looks like each of these upside down U's. So all the way on the left is difficult tasks. We have here on the x-axis anxiety and on the y-axis performance. Your performance is best when you're low in with arousal. We don't want to be so low that we're, again, like a zombie, but low enough that we're cool, calm, and collected. We're going to go all the way to the right. On an easy task, so we're talking about something like those simple math questions, you actually want to have higher arousal relative to the previous two. You don't want to be so aroused, your heart's racing so fast that you can't concentrate at all. Like there is a high end of this. If you take 3 energy drinks and a cup of coffee, there is a high end of this that's undesirable. But you do want, relatively speaking, higher levels of overall arousal. What I would like you to do is draw sort of these 3 upside down U's side by side by side and have the terms optimal for difficult, optimal for medium, and optimal for easy. It's very common that this visual appears on the AP exam. Basically, at the end of the day, the Yerkes-Dodson law boils down to this. The more complex the task is, the lower your overall arousal should be to perform at an optimal level. And as long as you articulate that, if this is an FRQ bullet, and this is a common FRQ bullet, that would score. So, for example, if it asked you how this term applies to a dance competition, you would say, so-and-so is performing in a complex, challenging dance competition. In order for their performance to be at peak, they should actually show up with lower levels of arousal. So, for example, it would be ideal to show up cool, calm, and collected with a low enough heart rate so that this individual can focus on their dance routine or their presentation, whatever it might be, without being too amped up. And you can sort of flip this in reverse. If this term was provided to you and it asked how it could hinder, you could very easily say that you get too amped up. And that's really the underlying crux of this. In each of these circumstances, you either can show up too relaxed or too amped up. And if you show up to a task too relaxed or too amped up, you're going to perform poorly. So you kind of want that nice middle ground. And then it's relative to performance and task difficulty. I always like to provide this example. You don't have to copy any of this down, but before Super Bowl 36, that was the first Super Bowl that Tom Brady and the Patriots won. Tom Brady actually fell asleep in the locker room. I would certainly argue that he didn't play the greatest game ever, but he played well enough, and certainly towards the end of the game played well enough. I think that is a clear example of a very, very difficult task. He showed up with a low enough level of anxiety that he could actually fall asleep in the locker room and then performed well enough to win the Super Bowl. I think that's a great example of the Yerkes-Dodson law working favorably for Tom Brady and the Patriots. There is an additional element related to arousal theory that we need to address, and it's just sort of called arousal theory itself. So we're not talking about optimal performance on a task. We're just talking about arousal broadly. Some individuals desire higher levels of physiological arousal than others. So, for example, there are people that want to skydive and go rock climbing and do all of these high danger, risky behaviors. Well, those people are high arousal seekers. They seek out experiences that match their desired level of arousal. And then there are people, honestly, like me, that look at that picture to the right and say, that's perfect. I have a cat laying on the couch and reading a book with the cat. Sounds like a good night to me. That is low arousal. That's sort of what I seek. But each individual person is going to carry out and be motivated. Again, this is in a motivation subunit. People are going to be motivated to seek behaviors that match their underlying desired levels of physiological arousal. And again, physiological arousal means heart rate, breathing rate, etc. The final column all the way to the right is separated a little bit from where we just were. I have it labeled as influences. And we're going to define the difference between what's called intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This is going to be one of those examples where we see two terms sort of side by side because I think it's important to see them like this. We'll start, of course, on the left, as we typically do, with intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you are motivated to carry out a behavior, as we say, for its own sake, meaning you really just love the behavior. You would be willing to do the behavior even if there is no external incentive or reward. So, for example, if you really just love art, you would paint at home on your free time just because you love it, because you want to master it. You do not anticipate getting paid. You're not trying to get a scholarship. You're not trying to get recognition. You literally just love to paint. You are intrinsically motivated. If you've ever taken a class and in the back of your mind, you're like, of course I care about grades, but I enjoy this content so much, I would be willing to learn it on my free time. I'm showing up to class because I want to master this, and it's not necessarily because I want to pass the SATs. You are intrinsically motivated. You have such an enjoyment for the behavior or the topic that you're really willing just to do it for its own sake. People who are intrinsically motivated are much more efficient and effective in how they carry out that behavior, their willingness to do that behavior, their overall performance, and they obviously enjoy it more. They're willing to work way harder. They're willing to enjoy it. And at the end of the day, behaviors in which intrinsic motivation is present are way more ideal than behaviors that are extrinsically motivating. So an extrinsically motivating behavior is something that you do for the incentive. So for example, you take a class, you could care less about the content, but you take it because you need it for your GPA, or you want the AP credits, or you need to master the content for the SATs, and you don't care about the content, you have no passion for it, you just want that grade. That's what we call extrinsic motivation, and it's certainly way less effective. Of course, you'll go to work, you'll, for example, paint for money if that's what you're being offered to do, but you might not necessarily love it. When you are motivated by fame and fortune, yeah, you might do it, but at the end of the day, you're going to enjoy it way, way less, and it's probably going to be less overall effective as a motivator. So, for example, to take a step back and look at these side by side, if it's possible, it's not always possible, but if it's possible, if you are responsible for running a business, the more intrinsic motivation that you can instill into your work environment, the better. If your colleagues and your employees are intrinsically motivated, meaning they love their job, I wouldn't necessarily say they would do it at home on their free time per se, but they don't mind showing up to work. They feel like they have a connection to the project. They feel like they have a connection to the direction of the business. If they feel like they really do enjoy it, they love it, they want to master it, they're doing it for its own sake, those employees are going to work way harder and they're actually going to enjoy their work, as opposed to people who are just showing up for the paycheck. If you are just showing up for the paycheck, then obviously you're not going to have that great passion for the behavior, for that career path. You're just there for the incentive, or in some cases to avoid punishment. You certainly don't want to get evicted from your home because you can't pay the rent. So the more intrinsic motivation you can instill, the better. As a mnemonic, I look at the word intrinsic, I see the IN, and I think this is the stuff that's in your heart. This is the stuff that you do on your free time because you love it. Music, art, dancing, etc. Extrinsic motivation is when there's something like an extreme amount of fame and fortune that's motivating you, but in and of itself might not be the most powerful motivator. People that are intrinsically motivated, so again, behaviors that you really love, so people that have high intrinsic motivation are really across the board. They enjoy it more. They think they're better at it. They think there's a degree of choice involved, even if there's not. So there's a very clear series of really strong connections between people who are highly intrinsically motivated. I love to connect this with academics. So this is a snapshot of 2 years of my college career. When I went to college and I got to pick my classes, I would take 5 courses a semester. That's the typical. I would always take courses that were intrinsically motivating. So for example, in fall of 2011, I took crim law. I was a history major, a political science minor. Crim law was not related to those, but I took it out of curiosity. This course was intrinsically motivating. I also took a course every semester that was extrinsically motivating, meaning I was only rewarded by the necessity to graduate. So for example, I have never been very good at Spanish or any foreign language. I took Spanish 1 because it was a necessity to graduate. I was only motivated by the degree at the end of the 4 years. So this is a pretty good snapshot of what my college academic experience was like. I took 3 classes for my major, so 3 classes about history, an intrinsically motivating class solely out of curiosity, slowly because I wanted to master it or was motivated to take the class because the content seemed interesting, and then a graduation necessity. You follow that up into the next year, same deal. I took environmental studies, totally intrinsically motivating. Then I took another Spanish course, and then 3 classes related to my major, U.S. History, Cuban Rev, and the election of 2012. The final element related to this is an unfortunate byproduct of the intrinsic-extrinsic motivation difference that we just established. It's what we call the over-justification effect, and it's the final bullet, the final box in this concept map. If you are intrinsically motivated, meaning you love to paint, you love to play music, you love to write music, you love a topic for the sake of it, you'd be willing to do it for free. If that topic becomes your career, and now all of a sudden you're doing it for a paycheck, you're doing it the way somebody else wants, where extrinsic motivation is provided, there can then be a decrease in intrinsic motivation. So, for example, you love to paint. You paint whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want. And then all of a sudden you decide, I'm going to take this passion and be paid for it. That's risky because all of a sudden you have to paint what other people want, the way they want, on their schedule, with their deadlines. Your passion for art could, in theory, decrease. Your love and intrinsic motivation could decrease. You could become sick of a hobby or a behavior that for your entire life you've absolutely loved. I think this happens with some professional athletes where for all of their career, they've loved it. In high school and college, yeah, there's rules and regulations and all this stuff pertaining to when practice happens, but they love it. They love football, they love basketball, they love field hockey, whatever it might be, tennis. They get to the pros, and now all of a sudden, there's all this responsibility about when you show up and how you play and following what the coach wants. And now all of a sudden, you've spent 25 years absolutely in love with baseball, but at the age of 26, you say, I'm actually kind of sick of this. I feel like I'm doing this for the paycheck and not the sport. And some people will continue to play year after year because it's just a job. It went from your first love, baseball, to a job. That's the concern. We call this phenomenon the over-justification effect, where something that you had passion for and that you loved becomes a job or becomes something that you do for fame or fortune. And now as a result, your underlying passion begins to wane. You can see this with musicians, you can see this with professional athletes, you can really see this across the board, where somebody may have, for the entirety of their life, absolutely loved a certain behavior. They did it for the sake of it. They did it for the reward of just mastery, with no financial expectations. but now it's their job. They've just kind of grown sick of it. For example, they've been writing their whole life, and now they have to write, but also have to follow deadlines. And they're like, oh, I used to just love to sit at home and write, and now I have to do it as my job as a journalist. That's just miserable. This phenomenon of, I love to draw, you're hired as a professional artist, but now you have to do it on somebody else's accord, somebody else's schedule. This phenomenon is what we call the over-justification effect. And as an FRQ bullet, this one is never going to help you. This sort of always ultimately results in the person losing their passion for the original behavior that they loved.